When 10-year-old Derek uncovers a chilling secret about his father's fiancée, Monica, and her so-called brother, George, he faces threats, lies, and danger. But Derek refuses to stay silent. With courage beyond his years, he takes on a daring mission to protect his father and expose the truth before it's too late. Will his bravery save the day, or will the criminal's dark plans succeed? A story of courage, betrayal, and justice you won't forget. Hey everyone, welcome back to this channel. If you love thrilling stories packed with twists, suspense, and justice, you're in the right place. Before we dive into today's captivating tale, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. We'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell us which country you're watching from. We're always excited to see where our amazing audience is tuning in from. Alright, grab a snack, get comfortable, and let's jump into this unforgettable story. The full story. The bustling aroma of sizzling steaks and freshly baked bread filled the cozy atmosphere of Haven's Grill, a trendy downtown eatery all on a busy New York City street. The restaurant was packed with chatter, laughter, and the occasional clinking of glasses. Jake Daniels and his 10-year-old son, Derek, sat in a quiet corner booth, each lost in their own thoughts. Jake studied the menu with the distracted air of someone pretending to focus. In truth, his mind wasn't on the dinner or the day's events, it was on Derek. He glanced across the table at his son, who was fiddling with the salt shaker, clearly disinterested in the outing. Jake sighed. It had been months since they'd spent any meaningful time together, and the distance between them seemed to widen with every passing day. "How about a burger, champ?" Jake asked, trying to sound upbeat. Derek shrugged, barely looking up. "Sure, whatever." Jake pressed his lips together, frustrated but unwilling to show it. He hated the growing wall between them, the silence that had crept into their once easy bond. Just as he was about to say something, his attention was drawn to a commotion near the entrance. The door swung open, and in walked a woman who seemed to command the room without trying. She was striking, with shoulder-length blonde hair that shimmered under the soft overhead lights. Her cobalt blue dress hugged her figure elegantly, but it was her smile, warm and effortless, that truly drew attention. She was followed by a tall man with a rugged look, his sharp jawline and piercing eyes exuding quiet confidence. He wore a casual leather jacket and jeans, his demeanor relaxed but alert. Jake noticed the way heads turned as the pair made their way to a table near the center of the room. Even the servers seemed momentarily distracted. But what caught Jake's attention most wasn't the woman's beauty, or the man's imposing presence. It was the way they interacted. They spoke in low voices, leaning in close, their body language intimate yet reserved. It piqued his curiosity in a way he couldn't quite explain. "Dad," Derek's voice snapped Jake out of his thoughts. "Are we ordering, or what?" Jake cleared his throat, feeling a bit foolish for a staring. "Yeah, let's order. You want fries with that burger?" "Sure," Derek replied, then added under his breath, "You're distracted anyway." Before Jake could respond, the woman's laughter rang out, a melodic sound that carried across the restaurant. Derek followed his father's gaze, his brow furrowing as he observed the pair. "They look like they're up to something," Derek murmured, more to himself than to Jake. Jake chuckled. "Not everyone's up to something, buddy. Maybe they're just friends catching up." But even as he said it, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the duo than met the eye. As the meal went on, Jake found himself glancing toward the pair more often than he intended. The woman, Monica, as the man called her, seemed animated, gesturing as she spoke. The man, George, listened intently, nodding occasionally, but his eyes frequently darted around the room, as if scanning for something or someone. Derek, too, was paying attention. He didn't say much, but Jake noticed how his son's eyes lingered on the man's leather jacket and the way he seemed to keep his back to the wall. "They're weird," Derek said finally, his voice low. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Weird? How?" "I don't know. They just don't seem normal," Derek replied, picking at his fries. "Like, why does he keep looking around like that?" Jake glanced over again, this time more carefully. George's gaze was indeed darting around the restaurant, but he dismissed it as paranoia. "Maybe he's just nervous. Nervous people don't act like that," Derek countered. "He looks like he's waiting for something to go wrong." Jake was about to brush it off when Monica's gaze suddenly locked with his. She smiled. A quick, disarming gesture that made him feel like he'd been caught staring. Jake smiled back awkwardly and looked away, his face flushing. "She saw you," Derek teased, a small smirk breaking his usual stoic demeanor. Jake chuckled, scratching the back of his neck. "Yeah, well, it's rude to stare. Eat your fries." But moments later, Monica and George stood, their meal apparently finished. As they made their way toward the exit, Monica glanced at Jake and Derek again. This time, her smile lingered. To Jake's surprise, she approached their table. "Hi there," she said, her voice smooth and friendly. "I couldn't help but notice you too. Are you father and son?" Jake blinked, taken aback. Yeah, that's right." Monica's smile widened. "It's sweet to see. Not many fathers take the time to have dinner with their kids these days." Jake shrugged modestly. "Well, I try." Derek, however, was less than impressed. He slouched in his seat, his expression guarded. "I'm Monica," she said, extending a hand. "And this is my brother, George." Jake shook her hand, his grip firm but polite. "Jake. And this is my son, Derek." "Nice to meet you," Monica said warmly, then glanced at Derek. "You're lucky to have a dad like him." Derek muttered something under his breath that Jake couldn't quite catch. Monica didn't seem to notice, or chose to ignore it. With a final smile, she and George left the restaurant, disappearing into the evening. Jake watched them go, a strange feeling settling in his chest. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something about the encounter felt significant. "You think they're trouble?" Derek asked, breaking the silence. Jake shook his head, though he wasn't entirely sure. "No, just two people passing through. Nothing to worry about." But as they left the restaurant that night, Jake couldn't shake the image of Monica's lingering smile, or the unease it stirred within him. Jake Daniels, a man in his late 30s, was the epitome of resilience and quiet strength. Standing at 6 feet tall with a lean, athletic build, his dark complexion and chiseled features reflected his African-American heritage and the hard work that had shaped his life. His sharp, expressive eyes often carried a mix of warmth and melancholy, a reflection of the joy he once knew and the losses he had endured. 5 years ago, Jake had lost the love of his life, his wife Susan, to a sudden illness. The pain of her passing was a wound that hasn't fully healed. Despite his grief, Jake had thrown himself into his role as a father to their only child, Derek, determined to fill the void left by her absence. As the CEO of a thriving tech company in New York City, Jake's professional life was marked by success, but it came at a cost. His relentless work schedule often kept him away from home, leaving little time for the one person who needed him most, Derek. Jake's love for his son was undeniable, but it was clear that the demands of his career had created a rift. The guilt of not being as present as he wanted to be weighed heavily on him. His heart ached each time he saw the loneliness in Derek's eyes or noticed the subtle ways his son tried to mask his sadness. Despite the challenges, Jake remained a man of integrity and compassion. He was deeply introspective, often reflecting on the lessons life had taught him. His quiet demeanor belied a sharp intellect and a dry sense of humor that only those close to him got to witness. He had a strong moral compass and an unwavering commitment to protecting those he loved, even if it meant making difficult sacrifices. On the surface, Jake appeared to have it all: wealth, status, and respect. But beneath the polished exterior was a man yearning for connection. He longed to feel the warmth of love again, to share his life with someone who could help him shoulder the weight of his responsibilities and bring light back into his home. Yet, his fear of making the wrong choice kept him cautious. He couldn't bear the thought of bringing someone into Derek's life who might not truly care for his son. It was this internal conflict that set the stage for the encounter that would change everything. On a quiet Saturday evening, Jake decided to take Derek out for dinner, a rare moment of bonding amidst the chaos of their lives. As they entered the bustling downtown restaurant, neither father nor son could have predicted the chain of events that would unfold, nor the woman who would become the catalyst for both hope and danger in their lives. Little did he realize that his encounter with Monica, a seemingly kind and enchanting stranger, would force him to confront not just his own vulnerabilities, but the very foundation of his world. Jake had been reluctant to attend the party, but his friend Chris had insisted. "You need to get out more," Chris had said, patting Jake on the back. "You've been hiding behind work for too long." And so, with minimal enthusiasm, Jake found himself at a chic Manhattan rooftop event, mingling among professionals and creatives, nursing a glass of bourbon. The evening was alive with laughter, music, and the low hum of conversations. Jake stood near the edge of the rooftop, looking out over the city skyline, his mind wandering back to Derek. He wondered if his son was managing the night without him, and guilt once again pricked at his heart. Lost in thought, he barely noticed someone approaching until a familiar voice broke through. "You have that faraway look again," said a warm, slightly teasing voice. Jake turned, startled to find himself face to face with Monica. Her smile was soft but confident, her blonde hair cascading over her shoulders in loose waves. She wore a simple yet elegant black dress that accentuated her figure, and her blue eyes sparkled under the ambient string lights. For a moment, Jake was caught off guard, his mind flashing back to the brief yet striking encounter at the restaurant. "Monica, right," he said, his voice tinged with surprise. She laughed, a light sound that seemed to ease the tension, didn't realize he was holding. "I'm impressed, you remembered. And you're Jake, the attentive dad. I hope your son enjoyed his meal that night." Jake chuckled. He did, though I think he enjoyed the dessert more. They shared a laugh, and for the first time in a long while, Jake felt a genuine sense of ease in someone else's presence. As the conversation flowed, he learned more about Monica. She spoke of her love for art and her recent move to New York to find inspiration and new opportunities. There was an air of mystery about her enough to intrigue Jake, but not raise alarm. "So, what brings you here?" Jake asked, gesturing to the lively crowd. "Chris is an old friend," she replied. "He insisted I come, and said I needed to expand my network, and you, the same. Chris has a way of dragging people out of their comfort zones." At one point, Chris joined them, a broad grin on his face. "I see you two have met," he said. "Jake, Monica's an artist. She's got a real eye for detail. And Monica, Jake here is one of the sharpest tech minds in the city." "Chris," Jake said, shaking his head with mock exasperation, "always the matchmaker. I call it connecting good people." Chris replied with a wink before walking off. As the party began to wind down, Monica and Jake exchanged phone numbers. "It was nice talking to you again," Jake said. Maybe we'll run into each other more often. Monica's smile widened. I'd like that. As Jake walked away that night, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Little did he know that this chance meeting was not as serendipitous as it seemed, and the woman who had reignited his sense of connection would soon test the very fabric of his life. Over the next few months, Jake and Monica's connection deepened. Also, it seemed, their text exchanges began casually, sharing jokes, talking about work, and trading recommendations for books or movies. Monica always seemed to know the right thing to say to lighten Jake's heavy mood, and her attentiveness was something Jake hadn't realized he missed so much. Their first official date was at a quiet Italian restaurant in Brooklyn. Monica had chosen the place, describing it as one of her favorite spots. The dimly lit space, with its soft music and the scent of fresh basil in the air, felt almost magical. Jake noticed how Monica listened intently when he spoke about his life, especially when he talked about Derek. She asked about his favorite hobbies, his school life, and his relationship with his late mother. Derek sounds like an incredible boy, Monica said, her voice tinged with what seemed like genuine warmth. You must be so proud of him. I am, Jake replied, his smile fading slightly. But sometimes, I wonder if I'm doing enough for him. Work keeps me so busy, and he's been quiet lately. I don't know if I'm missing something. Monica reached across the table, placing her hand gently over his. You're doing your best, Jake, and from what you've told me, your best is more than enough. For the first time in years, Jake felt like someone understood the weight he carried. As the weeks turned into months, Monica became a regular part of Jake's life. She would join him for coffee on weekends, attend art exhibits, and even suggested they take Derek to the museum together. The outing was a success, or so it appeared. Derek remained polite, but reserved around Monica, though Jake chalked it up to his son needing time to adjust. Monica also made subtle moves to ingratiate herself with Jake's inner circle. She charmed his friends at gatherings, laughed at their jokes, and impressed them with her artistic knowledge. Even Chris, a self-proclaimed skeptic of romantic entanglements, gave her his seal of approval. She's good for you, Chris said one evening over drinks. It's been a long time since I've seen you this happy. But not everything was as seamless as it seemed. Derek, ever observant, noticed little things about Monica that didn't sit right. Once, while looking for his sketch pad in the living room, he overheard Monica talking to someone on the phone. Her tone was sharp, her words curt. Nothing like the soft-spoken woman she presented to Jake. When she noticed Derek, she quickly ended the call and plastered on a smile. Just dealing with some work stuff, she explained. Nothing to worrying about, Derek nodded, but his unease grew. Jake, however, was blind to the cracks forming in the facade. Monica's support felt like a lifeline, especially as work demanded more of him. She offered to help around the house, preparing meals, and even helping Derek with his homework on occasion. You're amazing, Jake told her one evening after dinner. I don't know how I'd manage without you. Monica's smile was radiant, but in her eyes, there was a flicker of something unreadable. I just want to make life easier for you, Jake, for both of you. 5 months after their reconnection, Jake found himself standing in a jewelry store, staring at a display of engagement rings. The decision hadn't come easily, but he was convinced it was the right one. Monica had brought light back into his life, and she seemed to genuinely care for Derek. It felt like the missing piece of their family was finally falling into place. When he proposed to Monica over dinner at a rooftop restaurant, her reaction was everything he had hoped for. Also, he thought, tears streamed down her face as she nodded, and the guests at nearby tables applauded. Yes, Jake, she whispered, pulling him into a tight embrace. 1,000 times, yes. As Jake held her, he felt a wave of relief and excitement. He had no way of knowing that, for Monica, the moment was less about love and more about the culmination of a plan years in the making. The late autumn sun cast a warm, golden glow over the Daniels' home, the kind of light that made everything seem calm and inviting. It was a picturesque setting, with trees shedding their fiery leaves and a gentle breeze rustling through the neighborhood. From the outside, the Daniels' house exuded stability and charm, a symbol of a life Jake had worked tirelessly to build. But as the moving van pulled into the driveway that morning, it brought with it the first tangible crack in the foundation. Monica stood on the porch, her perfectly manicured hands clasped together as she watched George step out of the van. He was dressed casually, wearing a worn leather jacket over a plain t-shirt, and he carried himself with the confident ease of someone who felt at home wherever he went. Jake, standing a few feet away, observed the man he'd been told was Monica's brother. He'd agreed to let George stay, albeit reluctantly, after weeks of Monica's quiet persuasion. "Jake, thank you again for this," Monica said softly, turning to him with a smile that could have melted the iciest of hearts. "It means so much to me and to George. He's been through so much lately, and I know this will help him get back on his feet." Jake returned her smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Family looks out for each other," he replied, more out of obligation than conviction. As George approached, Monica introduced him with a warm flourish. "George, this is Jake, the man who's been so generous to us. Jake, meet my brother." George extended a hand, his grip firm and his smile easy. "Thanks, man. I really appreciate this. Monica's told me a lot about you." Jake nodded, his expression neutral. "Glad we could help." Derek, standing just inside the doorway, watched the scene unfold with cautious eyes. He hadn't been thrilled about the idea of someone else moving in, especially someone he barely knew. George's smile seemed forced to Derek, the kind of smile that hid more than it revealed. But he kept his thoughts to himself, knowing his father had already made up his mind, or rather, Monica had made it up for him. The guest house, a modest two-bedroom structure at the back of the property, had been unused for years. Jake had initially planned to renovate it into a home office or a rental property, but the idea had been put on hold as life got busier. Now, it would serve as George's temporary home. Back at the main house, Jake sat at the kitchen table, staring into his coffee mug if it held the answers to the questions swirling in his mind. He didn't like the idea of having someone else so close, disrupting the quiet balance he and Derek had maintained. But Monica had been insistent, her arguments cloaked in concern and love. She'd painted George as a man down on his luck, someone who just needed a chance to rebuild. Jake wanted to believe her. "Is he going to stay forever?" Derek's voice broke the silence, startling Jake. Jake looked up to see his son leaning against the doorframe, his expression wary. "No," Jake replied firmly, "just until he gets back on his feet." Derek nodded slowly, but his eyes betrayed his doubt. "I hope you're right." In the weeks that followed, George became a fixture in their lives. He was charming and affable, always quick with a joke or a helping hand. He offered to fix the squeaky gate, helped Monica with the groceries, and even tossed a football with Derek a few times, though the boy's reluctance was obvious. To Jake, George seemed harmless enough, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something was slightly off. George was always around, always watching, yet he managed to keep himself just enough in the background to avoid suspicion. He rarely spoke about his past, brushing off questions with vague answers and deflecting with a smile. But to Derek, George's presence felt invasive. He noticed the way George and Monica shared private glances when they thought no one was looking, the way their conversations would abruptly shift when Jake entered the room. It was subtle, but enough to set off warning bells in the boy's mind. He began keeping a mental log of their interactions, piecing together a puzzle he didn't yet understand. One evening, as Jake worked late in his home office, Derek wandered outside. The cool night air bit at his skin, but he didn't mind. He walked toward the guest house, his curiosity outweighing his hesitation. Through the slightly parted blinds, he could see George and Monica sitting on the couch, their heads close together. They were laughing about something, their body language far too intimate for siblings. Derek's stomach turned. He backed away slowly, careful not to make a sound. Whatever was going on, it wasn't right. Inside the guest house, Monica leaned back against the couch, her laughter fading as she glanced toward the window. "We need to be careful," she said in a low voice, her tone serious. George smoked, taking a sip of his beer. "Relax, Moan, the kid's harmless, and Jake. He's practically gift-trapped." Monica shot him a warning look. "Don't get cocky. We've worked too hard to mess this up now." George leaned forward, his expression darkening. "Just stick to the plan. Keep Jake happy. Keep the kid distracted, and we'll be out of here with everything we need before they even realize what hit them." Monica nodded, but her eyes flickered with unease. She'd always been the mastermind, the one who stayed in control. But this time, she couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was going to ruin everything. As they plotted their next move, they were unaware that Derek, their silent observer, was already beginning to connect the dots. The peaceful rhythm of the Daniels household began to shift after George moved into the guest house. It started subtly at first, like a single drop of water before a storm. Initially, he maintained the facade of a grateful guest, keeping to himself and making occasional small gestures of help mowing the lawn, washing Jake's car, or running errands for Monica. Jake appreciated the effort, even if he still harbored an undercurrent of unease. But slowly, George's presence began to evolve into something more invasive, and Monica seemed all too eager to accommodate it. The first gathering happened on a Saturday night. Jake had gone out of town for a business meeting, leaving Monica and George with the house to themselves. Derek, ever the reserved observer, stayed in his room, poring over his school books, but always keeping an ear to the ground. The faint pulse of music began around 8 p.m., emanating from the guest house. At first, it was just a low thrum, but as the night wore on, it grew louder, accompanied by bursts of laughter and voices. Derek peeked out his window. The backyard, usually a quiet retreat, was now alive with movement. Figures gathered near the patio, some lounging in folding chairs, others dancing near the faint glow of lanterns strung between the trees. George was in the center of it all, his voice booming with jokes and stories that drew laughter from the crowd. Monica flitted around like a social butterfly, a glass of wine in hand, her laughter mingling with the others. Derek's stomach churned. The scene felt out of place, foreign. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. His father had always maintained a sense of order and quiet in their lives, and now it was as if a whirlwind had swept through, undoing it all. The party continued late into the night, the music only growing louder. Derek debated whether to say something to Monica, but ultimately decided against it. She hadn't been approachable lately, her demeanor toward him cool and distant. She'd always been friendly in the past, but now, it felt as though her attention was solely focused on George and whatever they were doing. The parties became a weekly ritual. Sometimes, they were confined to the guest house, with muffled laughter and clinking glasses spilling into the night. Other times, they sprawled into the main house, with strangers lounging in the living room and kitchen, treating the space as if it were their own. Jake, often working late or traveling, remained oblivious to the growing chaos. "Do you think Dad knows about this?" Derek finally asked Monica one morning, after yet another sleepless night. She was standing at the kitchen counter, pouring herself coffee. Her response was curt. "Of course, he knows. He trusts George and me to keep things under control. It's just a little fun, Derek. You should loosen up." Derek wanted to argue, but he bit his tongue. He could tell she wouldn't listen. One evening, Jake arrived home earlier than expected. He walked into the house to find George and Monica laughing over a bottle of wine in the living room. The sight stopped him in his tracks. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. Monica turned to him with a practiced smile. "Oh, Jake, you're home early. George and I were just having a quiet drink. It's been a long week, and we thought we'd unwind." Jake glanced at George, who raised his glass in a mock toast. "Care to join us?" George offered, his tone casual. Jake shook his head. "No, thanks, I'm tired." As he walked past them toward the stairs, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Monica and George were too comfortable, too familiar. But Jake, always trusting, chalked it up to his overactive imagination. After all, Monica was his fiancée, and George was her brother. There was no reason to suspect anything. But Derek knew better. He watched as the parties continued, each one more boisterous than the last. Strangers became regulars, their faces and names unknown to him, but disturbingly familiar to George and Monica. The guest house, once a quiet refuge, now felt like the epicenter of a world that didn't belong in their family's life. One night, as Derek tried to fall asleep, the sounds of laughter drifted through the walls. He couldn't ignore the pit growing in his stomach. These weren't the actions of a loving fiancée and her grateful brother. This was something else, something calculated. Derek didn't know what they were planning, but he knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. Quietly, he resolved to start paying closer attention, to listen more carefully, and to document what he saw. He might not have known how to stop it yet, but he knew one thing for certain: George and Monica were not who they claimed to be. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon when Jake had to leave for a last-minute business meeting. Monica and George, as usual, disappeared into the guest house shortly after Jake left, leaving Derek alone in the house. Derek, always vigilant, felt the now familiar knot of unease in his stomach. He had learned to keep a low profile whenever Monica and George were together, but today, his curiosity gnawed at him. Something about the way they whispered before disappearing felt different, urgent. Derek stayed in his room for a while, trying to distract himself with homework, but his thoughts kept circling back to them. Why were they so secretive? What were they hiding? The questions swirled in his mind, and before he could stop himself, he found his feet moving toward his father's bedroom. It was a place he rarely entered, a space sacred to Jake and filled with his belongings. As he approached the door, he noticed it was ajar. That was unusual. Jake never left his room unlocked. Derek's pulse quickened. He hesitated at the threshold, glancing back down the hall to make sure he wasn't being watched. Slowly, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was pristine, as always, with everything in its place. But something stood out immediately. Monica's laptop was open on the desk, its screen glowing faintly in the dim light. Derek frowned. She never used Jake's room to work. She had her own office downstairs. Why would her laptop be here? He approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. The screen displayed a document, the title bold and unmistakable: Jake's master plan. Derek froze, his breath catching in his throat. His father's name, paired with a title like that, it felt ominous. His curiosity overpowered his fear, and he leaned in to read. The document was a detailed, chilling account of Monica and George's plans. It outlined how Monica had met Jake at the restaurant and strategically inserted herself into his life. She had manipulated his grief, his need for companionship, and his guilt over neglecting Derek. George's move into the guest house was another calculated step. giving them unrestricted access to Jake's home and resources. The deeper Derek read, the more his stomach churned. The plan wasn't just about siphoning money. It was about total destruction. The document hinted at forging legal documents to gain access to Jake's assets, framing him for financial crimes, and eventually eliminating both him and Derek. There were even mentions of insurance policies that Monica had coerced Jake into updating, naming herself as the primary beneficiary. Derek's hands trembled as he scrolled through the document. Every word felt like a punch to the gut. These people, Monica, who Jake trusted enough to propose to, and George, who lived just steps away, were not family. They were predators, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Suddenly, voices echoed from outside. Monica and George were heading back to the house. Panic surged through Derek. He quickly closed the document, shut the laptop, and slipped out of the room, his heart racing. He darted back into his own room, shutting the door softly behind him. He leaned against the door, his chest heaving. The weight of what he had just discovered threatened to crush him. He wanted to tell his father immediately, but he knew it wouldn't be that simple. Jake was too enamored with Monica, too trusting. And George was a volatile presence, always watching, always waiting. Derek knew he couldn't handle this alone. The only person who might help was his teacher, Miss Grant. She had always been kind to him, noticing the changes in his demeanor and reaching out when no one else did. If anyone could help him figure out what to do next, it was her. But for now, all he could do was wait and bide his time. The truth was out there, and he was determined to make sure Monica and George didn't succeed. As fear and resolve warred within him, Derek realized that his life and his father's would never be the same again. The weeks leading up to Jake and Monica's wedding were a whirlwind of preparations, appearances, and a growing undercurrent of tension. Monica and George had become experts at maintaining a facade of normalcy, carefully concealing their sinister intentions beneath a veneer of charm and cooperation. Derek, however, was a constant thorn in their side, a reminder of the threat they hadn't yet neutralized. Monica knew that Derek had become more watchful. She'd catch his eyes on her, his expression wary and calculating, far beyond his years. She hated it. The boy was far too smart for his own good, and his presence unnerved her. Every time she glanced at him, she felt a crack in the careful structure she and George had built. "We need to do something about him," she hissed to George one evening in the dimly lit confines of the garage, where he still pretended to live. "He's going to ruin everything." George leaned back against the wall, arms crossed, his dark eyes narrowing. "The kid's a problem, sure, but Jake, he won't believe a word out of his mouth. The guy's head over heels for you. It's almost pathetic." "Almost isn't good enough," Monica snapped, pacing the small space. "What if he finds proof? He's always watching, always listening." "He's going to figure us out," George smirked, a cruel edge to his expression. "Then we make sure he doesn't have the chance." Monica's eyes darted to him, uncertain. "What do you mean?" "Relax," George said, waving her off. "I'm not saying we get rid of him. Not yet, anyway. But we can scare him enough to keep him quiet. A little accident at school, maybe. A reminder that bad things happen when people don't mind their business." Monica hesitated. She didn't like the idea of drawing unnecessary attention, especially so close to the wedding. But George's plan made a sick sort of sense. If Derek was too afraid to speak out, their secret would remain safe. "Fine," she said, her voice tight. "But nothing that brings the police into this. We don't need any extra heat." Meanwhile, Jake was oblivious to the brewing storm around him. In his eyes, Monica could do no wrong. She was warm and attentive, her charm radiating like sunlight. She took an active interest in his life and work, always ready with an encouraging word or a thoughtful gesture. Even more, she seemed determined to build a bond with Derek, at least when Jake was around. "Monica's really trying, you know," Jake told Derek one evening as they sat at the dinner table. "I know this has been hard on you, but she cares about you. She wants us to be a family." Derek didn't respond, pushing his food around his plate. His silence frustrated Jake, but he told himself to be patient. Derek was just adjusting, he reasoned. Kids didn't handle change well. What Jake didn't see were the sharp glares Monica shot Derek when his back was turned, or the subtle ways she undermined him. She'd dismiss his opinions, mock his interests, and twist his words to paint him as difficult and ungrateful. When Jake wasn't looking, she made it clear to Derek that she was in control, and that no one would believe him if he tried to say otherwise. As the wedding drew closer, Monica and George intensified their efforts. They knew they had to cover their tracks thoroughly. George worked behind the scenes, erasing old identities and ensuring that nothing could be traced back to their past crimes. Monica, meanwhile, focused on cementing her place in Jake's life. But the truth was far darker. In private, Monica and George strategized their next move. George would wait until after the wedding to finalize the plan. When Monica's name was on Jake's accounts and the insurance policies were updated to include her, the thought of their payout made George's eyes gleam with greed. Despite their efforts, Derek refused to back down. He kept a close watch on both Monica and George, piecing together snippets of conversations and behaviors that only deepened his distrust. He avoided being alone with them, knowing that any vulnerability could be exploited. One evening, Derek overheard a hushed conversation between the two in the garage. "It's almost done," Monica said. "Just a few more days. Once the wedding's over, we can move on." "Yeah," George replied. "And if the kid steps out of line, we'll handle it." No loose ends. Derek's heart pounded in his chest. They were planning something bigger than he'd imagined. In the days leading up to the wedding, tension filled the air. Monica was all smiles in front of Jake, her laughter ringing out like bells. But beneath the surface, she was calculating, always watching for signs that Derek might act. Jake, for his part, was blissfully unaware. He was consumed with excitement and nerves, eager to start a new chapter in his life. He spent hours writing vows, reflecting on how lucky he was to have found Monica. For Monica and George, everything was falling into place. But what they didn't realize was that Derek wasn't alone anymore. Miss Carter and the detective were quietly working behind the scenes, unraveling the lies that Monica and George had spun so carefully. As the wedding day approached, the stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything. The wedding day dawned with the kind of bright, cloudless sky that seemed almost symbolic. For Jake Daniels, it felt like the start of a new chapter, one filled with hope, love, and the promise of a future he had long yearned for. Derek sat silently in his room, dressed in a formal suit that felt suffocating. His young face was pale, his expression tense. He hadn't slept much the night before, his mind replaying the plan over and over, searching for cracks that might spell disaster. Miss Carter had visited him early that morning, her calm presence a balm to his frayed nerves. She knelt in front of him, adjusting his tie with a maternal touch that made him ache for the simplicity of his old life. "Remember," she said softly, her voice steady. "You're not alone in this. The detective and the officers are in place. No matter what happens, just stick to the plan." Derek nodded, his throat dry. He wanted to believe her, but the weight of what he was about to do felt like too much for a 12-year-old to bear. Monica was a vision of bridal perfection, as she stood before the full-length mirror in the bridal suite. Her dress, a custom-designed masterpiece of lace and satin, hugged her figure in all the right places. Her golden hair was swept into an elegant updo, and the diamond earrings Jake had gifted her sparkled like tiny stars. George entered the room, dressed in a sharp black suit. His face was unreadable, but his eyes carried the cold intensity that Monica knew so well. "Everything set?" he asked, his voice low. Monica nodded, glancing at the clock. "In a few hours. It'll all be ours." "Not if the kid screws it up," George muttered, his jaw tightening. "He won't," Monica said firmly. "I've made sure of it." George gave her a look, a mix of skepticism and disdain, but he said nothing more. The estate's outdoor garden was a breathtaking sight. Rows of white chairs lined the aisle, which was adorned with cascading floral arrangements in shades of blush and cream. A string quartet played softly, setting a romantic mood as guests settled into their seats. The grand venue, a sprawling estate on the outskirts of Manhattan, buzzed with activity as florists, caterers, and staff hurried to finalize the lavish arrangements. Guests arrived in elegant attire, their laughter and chatter filling the air with a sense of celebration. Yet, beneath the surface of this picturesque day, a far darker reality simmered. Jake stood at the altar, his nerves visible in the way he shifted from foot to foot. But his face lit up when Monica appeared at the end of the aisle, her hand resting lightly on George's arm. She moved with practiced grace, her smile radiant. Derek sat in the front row, his hands clenched into fists on his lap. George sat beside him, leaning slightly toward him, his demeanor casual, but his words anything but. "Don't even think about it," George whispered, just loud enough for Derek to hear. "One wrong move, and I'll make sure you regret it." Derek's stomach churned, but he kept his face neutral, his mind focused on Ms. Carter's words. The ceremony proceeded smoothly, vows were exchanged, and Jake's heartfelt promises brought tears to the eyes of many guests. Monica's vows were equally moving, though Derek couldn't help but notice the subtle glances she exchanged with George. When the officiant reached the familiar line, "If anyone here knows of any reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace," the garden fell silent. It was Derek's cue. He stood abruptly, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure everyone could hear it. I, he began, his voice cracking. Before he could say another word, his knees buckled, and he collapsed to the ground. Gasps erupted from the crowd as Monica's face froze in shock. George's hand twitched toward his jacket, but he hesitated, unsure of what was happening. Miss Carter, seated a few rows back, leapt into action. "I'm his teacher," she called out, rushing to Derek's side. "I know him. He has a medical condition." The distraction was enough, as George shifted nervously to plainclothes officers moved in, their hands hovering near concealed weapons. Monica's gaze darted between Derek and George, her instinct screaming that something was wrong. When she saw the officers advancing, her blood ran cold. "George," she hissed, but it was too late. George reached for his gun, but the officers were faster. They had him pinned to the ground in seconds, their movements swift and efficient. Screams and cries filled the air as guests scrambled away from the sudden commotion. Derek opened his eyes just in time to see George being handcuffed, his face contorted in rage. Monica tried to slip away in the chaos, but another officer intercepted her near the garden's edge. Her protests were shrill and frantic, but they fell on deaf ears. "What's going on?" Jake demanded, his voice hoarse as he approached the scene. Derek stood shakily, his legs still weak, but his resolve stronger than ever. "They're not who you think they are, Dad," he said, his voice steady despite the tears brimming in his eyes. "What are you talking about?" Jake asked, his confusion deepening. "They're criminals," Derek said. "Monica and George, they're not who they say they are. They plan to hurt us, to take everything." The detective stepped forward, holding up a folder of evidence. "It's true, Mr. Daniels. We've been investigating them for months. They're wanted in multiple states for fraud, theft, and worse." Jake's face crumbled as the weight of the revelation hit him. He turned to Monica, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is this true?" Monica's expression hardened, all traces of her previous warmth gone. "You're an idiot, Jake," she spat. "You made it so easy." Monica and George were taken into custody, their schemes laid bare before the stunned wedding guests. Jake stood at the center of it all, a broken man grappling with the betrayal and the danger he had unwittingly brought into his family's life. But when he looked at Derek, standing bravely beside Miss Carter, he felt a flicker of hope. His son had saved him, saved them both, from a fate far worse than heartbreak. For the first time in years, Jake realized he had been given a second chance, not with Monica, but with Derek. And he vowed to never let anything come between them again. George and Monica were arraigned, and during the hearing the courtroom was packed to capacity. Spectators, journalists, and curious onlookers filled the benches, their murmurs a low hum of anticipation. At the center of it all sat Jake and Derek Daniels, flanked by their lawyer and Miss Carter. Jake's face was a mask of tension, but his hand rested reassuringly on Derek's shoulder, silently conveying his support. At the defense table, Monica and George sat with their attorneys. Monica wore a pale grey suit, her once charismatic demeanor replaced by icy indifference. George, on the other hand, radiated barely contained fury, his jaw clenched tightly as he stared straight ahead. "All rise," the bailiff called, his booming voice silencing the room. As the judge entered, everyone rose to their feet. Judge Marian Prescott, a stern woman in her 60s with piercing eyes and an air of authority, took her seat behind the bench. "Be seated," she commanded. The trial began with formalities, but the atmosphere grew charged when the prosecutor, a sharp and methodical man, Leonard Hale, called his first witness. Derek, dressed in a neatly pressed shirt and tie, made his way to the witness stand with hesitant steps. His young face betrayed a mix of nerves and determination. After being sworn in, he took his seat and glanced briefly at his father, who gave him an encouraging nod. "State your name for the record," Hale began. "Derek Daniels," the boy replied, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "Derek, can you tell the courts what you know about the defendants, Monica Harper and George Landry?" Hale's tone was calm, almost soothing. Derek swallowed hard and began. "It started when my dad met Monica. She seemed nice at first, but I noticed things that didn't add up. She and George, they weren't who they pretended to be." As Derek recounted the events leading up to the wedding, the courtroom hung on his every word. He spoke of finding Monica and George together at the restaurant, their strange behavior, and the discovery of the incriminating documents on Monica's laptop. "I knew something was wrong," he said, his voice growing stronger as he went on. "I told Miss Carter, my teacher, and she helped me figure out what to do." The document on Monica's laptop started with the meeting at the restaurant as prologue. The first item at the strategy segment was to find out every possible information about my father and his family, followed by the details of all information they got. The next of their move was to get close to my father's friend Chris, who unknowingly arranged Monica's second meeting with my father at his party. "Why didn't you tell your father right away?" Hale asked. Derek hesitated, his gaze dropping to his hands. "I didn't think he'd believe me. He was so happy with Monica. I didn't want to ruin it, unless I was sure. Hale nodded sympathetically. You did the right thing, Derek. Now, can you tell the court what happened on the wedding day? Derek described the events in vivid detail, the staged fainting, the moment George reached for his gun, and the police swooping in to arrest them. His testimony painted a clear picture of the danger they had faced. When Hale finished his questioning, Monica's attorney rose for cross-examination. The lawyer's attempts to rattle Derek with rapid-fire questions and insinuations fell flat. The boy's honesty and courage shone through, earning him silent admiration from the courtroom. When Derek stepped down, Leonard Hale rose again, this time holding a thick folder. Your Honor, the prosecution would like to present the findings of our investigation into the defendant's past activities. The judge nodded. Proceed. Hale stepped to the center of the courtroom, his voice steady and authoritative. The defendants, Monica Harper and George Landry, are career criminals with a long history of fraud, theft, and violence spanning multiple states. I will now detail their known offenses. He opened the folder and began listing the charges, each one more damning than the last. In 2017, the defendants posed as investment consultants in Los Angeles, defrauding over a dozen clients out of $2.3 million. They vanished before they could be apprehended. A collective gasp rippled through the room. In 2019, they orchestrated a scheme in Chicago, posing as philanthropists to embezzle funds from a children's hospital. The stolen amount totaled $1.8 million. Jake's fists clenched as he listened, his stomach churning with disgust. In 2021, the defendants were linked to a series of armed robberies in Atlanta, during which 3 people lost their lives. Witnesses identified George Landry as the shooter in one of these incidents. The courtroom grew deathly silent. Even the judge's composed expression tightened at the mention of the murders. Hale continued, his voice unrelenting. Most recently, the defendants targeted Mr. Jake Daniels, attempting to gain access to his substantial assets through a fraudulent marriage scheme. Their plan included eliminating both Mr. Daniels and his son once the funds were secured. Jake's head bowed as the weight of the revelation hit him. Derek reached for his father's hand, squeezing it tightly. The evidence against them is overwhelming, Hale concluded. We have documents recovered from Monica Harper's laptop, testimony from Derek Daniels and Miss Carter, and corroborating statements from other victims across the country. As Hale returned to his seat, Monica's carefully constructed composure finally cracked. This is ridiculous, she shouted, rising to her feet. They're making this up. It's all lies. The judge banged her gavel. Order in the court. Miss Harper, you will remain silent unless addressed. Monica sank back into her chair, her face flushed with anger. George leaned toward her, muttering something under his breath, his expression dark. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. The foreperson stood, her voice clear and unwavering. We find the defendants, Monica Harper and George Landry, guilty on all charges. The room erupted in murmurs as the weight of the decision settled over everyone present. Monica slumped in her chair, her face a mask of defeat. George stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists. As the judge sentenced them to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, Jake felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. He had narrowly escaped a devastating fate, but the betrayal still cut deep. Looking down at Derek, who sat beside him with quiet resolve, Jake knew one thing for certain. They had survived this ordeal together, and together they would heal. The nightmare was over, and it was time to rebuild their lives. The months following the trial were a period of healing and adjustment for Jake and Derek. The once gilded memories of Monica were replaced by the hard truths of her betrayal. Jake had to confront the emotional scars left by the ordeal, while Derek, despite his bravery, occasionally battled nightmares of what could have happened. In the midst of their recovery, one person emerged as a steady presence in their lives: Miss Carter. Miss Carter, or Lauren as Jake now called her, had initially stepped in to support Derek through the traumatic events. She took on more than just her role as his teacher. She became a mentor and confidant. Her warm, empathetic nature made her a natural caregiver. She volunteered to spend time with Derek after school, tutoring him when he struggled to catch up on his studies and offering him a safe space to express his fears. At first, Jake saw her involvement as a blessing for Derek. The bond between Lauren and his son was immediate and genuine. But as time passed, Jake couldn't help but notice how easily Lauren fit into their lives. She brought a sense of stability and comfort that their home hadn't seen in years. Lauren would stop by their apartment in the evenings, sometimes bringing homemade meals or helping Derek with his hobbies. Her laughter filled the quiet spaces, and her kindness melted the walls Jake had built around his heart. One evening, after Derek had gone to bed, Jake and Lauren found themselves sitting on the couch, sipping tea. "Thank you for everything," Jake said, his voice soft but sincere. "You've done so much for Derek, and for me. I don't know how we'd have gotten through this without you." Lauren smiled, her eyes meeting his. "You don't have to thank me, Jake. I care about both of you. Derek's an incredible kid, and, well, you're not so bad yourself." Jake chuckled, a rare sound that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. For the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of something more than gratitude. A deep admiration and affection for the woman who had brought light back into their lives. Over the next year, Jake and Lauren's bond grew stronger. What began as friendship blossomed into something more, though they took their time to ensure that their relationship wouldn't disrupt Derek's sense of stability. Derek, for his part, adored Lauren. He saw how happy she made his father, and how she genuinely cared for him too. When Jake sat him down one afternoon to ask how he felt about the idea of Lauren being a more permanent part of their lives, Derek didn't hesitate. "I think it's a great idea, Dad," he said, a wide grin spreading across his face. "She makes us both happy." Encouraged by his son's blessing, Jake proposed to Lauren a month later. The proposal was simple but heartfelt: a quiet dinner at the park, where they had spent many weekends together with Derek. Jake got down on one knee, his voice thick with emotion, as he asked Lauren to marry him. "Yes," she replied without hesitation, tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. Their wedding was a small, intimate affair held in the garden of a close friend's home. Derek served as Jake's best man, beaming with pride as he stood beside his father. Lauren looked radiant in her simple, elegant gown, and Jake couldn't take his eyes off her. As they exchanged vows, Jake's voice trembled with emotion. "Lauren, you came into our lives when we needed you most. You've shown me what love and family truly mean. I promise to cherish and protect you, just as you've done for us." Lauren's response was equally heartfelt. "Jake, you've taught me the power of resilience and the beauty of unconditional love. I'm honored to be part of your family, to stand by your side, and to love both you and Derek with all my heart." When the ceremony ended, and the newlyweds shared their first dance, Derek watched with a wide smile, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace. For the first time in a long time, their family felt whole again. Lauren officially moved into their home, and their life together was one of laughter, warmth, and support. She continued to guide Derek, not only as a teacher, but as a loving stepmother, while Jake found himself rediscovering the joy he thought he'd lost forever. Together, they built new traditions, celebrated milestones, and faced life's challenges as a united family. The shadows of the past no longer loomed over them. They had forged a new path filled with love and hope. As Jake sat on the porch one quiet evening, watching Lauren and Derek play catch in the yard, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. Life had tested him in unimaginable ways, but it had also given him a second chance, a chance to love, to heal, and to create a future worth cherishing. As the story comes to a close, we hope you've enjoyed this roller coaster of twists, suspense, and heartwarming moments. What did you think about Jake's journey, Derek's bravery, and the unexpected love story with Miss Carter? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. What was your favorite part of the story? And we'd love to hear from you. Drop the name of your country in the comments to let us know where you're watching from. It's amazing to connect with viewers from all over the world. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more captivating tales like this one. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for our next story. It's going to be just as thrilling. See you soon.